Thank you. It's incredible resources we get here, and this is why we, the nice thing about saltwater is kind of a road stovepipes. So we have these incredible human resources, Senator, Admiral, Young Explorer, and about a couple hundred other resources, which I hope we can all share. And right now we have about 20 minutes for, if you'd like to ask questions to the two of you can come up to the table, ask questions of Admiral Neffenger and of Erika. And I think we have a third mobile mic, so anybody who has a question, feel free to raise your hand. This is live.
Okay, question?
Admiral, I'm interested politically in what's going on with the upcoming conference in Sweden on the Arctic, and also what your feeling is of who else is coming, who else is representing the United States. Is it you, the State Department, et cetera, who's representing, and what are your goals for the agenda?
So there's a lot to that question, and let me just, for the benefit of those in the audience who may not know this, since 1996, an organization called the Arctic Council has existed, and that organization consists of 8 Arctic nations, as defined in the charter. And those Arctic nations are, Norway, Sweden, Iceland, Finland, Denmark, U.S., Russia, Canada. Of those, 5 are actual Arctic border states, and then the other 3, as I mentioned, were admitted as well. Now, the Arctic Council's charter is essentially, it was originally developed to find a way to talk about like areas of concern in the Arctic. This was before a lot of the development happened, but it was forward-thinking and looking at that. So the Arctic Council, as I say, consists of those, and each nation under the charter is required to appoint an individual called the senior Arctic official. Now, in our case, that's a woman at the State Department who is a senior Arctic official. And then some nations have, in addition, named an Arctic ambassador, so a diplomatic level. Every year, that council, there's a rotating chair of that council. Every 2 years, a new chair comes along. It's been Sweden the past 2 years. We are now getting into the second round of chairs. So if you think of 8 nations, it's been 16 years roughly since the Arctic Council was created. We're in the second round of people now having a second shot at it. So this year, the council chair transfers from Sweden to Canada. So the meeting that you're referring to that's happening this week in Sweden is an annual meeting, a biannual meeting of the heads of state, if you will, not heads of state, the senior ministers. It's called a ministerial. And so in our case, it's Secretary Kerry, State Department, and his counterparts from the other Arctic nations are meeting. And what they typically do is they look at the current agenda of the Arctic Council and they determine whether the Council is addressing the right things, whether the Council agrees to people who want to be permanent observers and so forth. It's a consensus-based organization, so all it takes is one no, and they can't move forward on something. So it's a little bit of a challenging organization. And as you might suspect, when you get a lot of senior diplomatic level people involved, there's a lot of diplomatic policy maneuvering associated with it. However, the Arctic Council also has a series of working groups underneath it, and those working groups are really focused on real-world problems. I mentioned the search and rescue agreement and the oil spill agreement. There's some discussion about a working group that would look at traffic management in the Arctic and so forth. So what do I think is going on right now? Well, we're about to move into 4 years of North American chairmanship of the Arctic Council. 2 years as Canada, and then we follow, the U.S. follows Canada as chairman in 2015. Here's what I think, and as I said, I've spent a lot of time in the Arctic, and I've made a number of trips to both the Russian Arctic, went up to the North Pole with the Russians just 3 weeks ago, and the other Arctic Council members spent a lot of time in the U.S. Arctic and in the Canadian Arctic. And there's general agreement that the nations have to cooperate. So that's a good sign. how that cooperation takes place is going to be the next question. But the good sign is the right words are being said, so you can call people on this. They've all said we want to cooperate, Russians, Canadians, everybody. And they said we want to cooperate in three fundamental areas. Responsible development, and that includes offshore oil and gas as well as shoreside development, and responsible including sustainable. So what do you do in areas of permafrost and permafrost melting and so forth? And we want to do so in a way that respects indigenous populations, because you have indigenous populations that care very much, not just about the land that they have, but they have whaling rights, and they have cultural traditions that people don't want to see destroyed or changed. Although by definition there's going to be some change there. And then the final piece is, how do you manage the traffic that's going to happen up there? What if this becomes a new trade route? So those are the three areas of agreed upon discussion. But as you can imagine, there's not agreed upon ways forward on all those areas. And so every one of these nations has been trying to get out a strategic vision. I would encourage you to really pay a lot of attention to what the Russians are saying. It's actually pretty fascinating. You want to find out what's happening in the Arctic, watch Russia, because Russia is in the vanguard of significant development. So I don't know if that it gets close to an answer for you. It's a long answer, but I... Well, I think it would be helpful to sign the law of the sea, and here's why. And again, from a very practical perspective. So for those of you who don't know, the Law of the Sea Treaty, which the United States originally advocated for back in the 70s and early 80s, we have not acceded to the treaty, although we did a lot of the work to create the treaty. And there's a lot of, there's a lot of arcana associated with it. But the bottom line is, if we were signatory to it, it would make discussions a little simpler. It doesn't mean you can't have those discussions. It doesn't mean that we can't continue to do the work we do. But it just would make the discussions easier, and it would avoid that opening question that you always get when you sit down with people who have signed the law of the sea treaty.
I have another question for you, Admiral. To continue along the lines of governance, I'm curious, you mentioned that the Arctic
Anyways, I'm interested, you had mentioned that the Arctic Council is a consensus-based governance system, and I understand that it's a difficult way to go, and you mentioned that as well. What form of governance would you, in the best possible world, your best possible world, suggest for not just Arctic, but for the planet's common?
So that's a big question. For those of you who didn't hear, she said, if the Arctic Council is a consensus-based organization, and there's always challenges associated with consensus-based because it only takes one person not to consent, and you don't have agreement. So what, in my opinion, would be a way forward, or how would you then govern, and what model might you use? I don't suggest that the Arctic Council is a bad organization by saying that. So I didn't mean to imply that. What I like about it is it's an organization that's focused on coming to consensus. So that's a very important point. They come together with the goal to find consensus. So they start to look at those areas where they can find it, first of all. That's why I mentioned those environment, indigenous populations, and reasonable management of the waterways. Those are areas that everyone agrees they can find consensus on. So that's good. What an organization like the Arctic Council doesn't have, because it was never designed to have it, is a way to implement these things. There's no action body associated with it, like there might be, say, with the United Nations through the International Maritime Organization. So let me give you maybe an analogy. So the UN is an organization that is focused on raising and discussing concerns of nations around the world. That's a big world of work. But they have a number of bodies that exist to actually implement things. So the International Maritime Organization is an arm of the UN that is focused on, and I'm simplifying this somewhat, but it's focused very directly on developing standards of operation for shipping, for commercial vessels around the world. How are they supposed to be built? How are they supposed to be operated? And what concerns do we have with respect to to their pollutants and emissions and so forth. So that's our focus. So I think what I'd like to see developed for the Arctic Council, and I think it can happen, is to take the work groups that you have and feed those products into some sort of an implementing organization. Whether that's some sort of a combined group that does response to oil spills or does response to search and rescue or conducts exercises and operations. Maybe it's a group that looks at how you then develop maritime traffic schema and so forth. But I think that what I'd like to see happen out of the next 4 years for North American chairmanship is to propose some sort of an implementing entity or entities that could take the work that comes out of there and find ways to make it actually happen. So then you take the burden off of what is an organization that can't do that because it's consensus-based, and you put it into entities that are just operationally focused. So I tend to think operational because I have to deal with the operators on a daily basis. So how do you take the ideas and turn them into, now what do I do about it right now? So there's a lot more to that, obviously, but I think those kinds of governance regimes are very practical. For governance, in my opinion, to work, it has to be practically focused. First of all, you actually have to have something for people to do. Otherwise, you'll just wring your hands forever, And at some point, you actually have to stop wringing your hands and go do something. And so, what do? You start with some of the things you can agree upon, because then that opens avenues for things that you don't agree upon to have a way to discuss it. So if you agree that you want to protect indigenous peoples, that's an easy thing to agree upon, right? It's a very hard thing to come to consensus on, because what does that mean? Well, does it mean we'll protect them by wiping out their village and building this nice new town for them to live in? Some people might say so. But it allows you, but if you have a way to begin to implement some simple things, like responsible development of coastlines and responsible port management and protection of migratory whale routes for those indigenous populations that are allowed to whale for their subsistence purposes. Then you can begin to open doors into those more challenging issues, because now you have a way you've begun to work together, and you start to surface those amongst working groups that they can come back with. All right, you couldn't get the consensus on this last thing, but here's a couple areas where we might do it. So those are some of my thoughts. To the extent that anybody listens to me, those are the kinds of things that I think about.
Two more, so Carlene.
Thank you very much, Admiral, for your reflections today. And I wanted to bring forward one of the 3 prongs that you discussed. You just mentioned safety, security, and for this particular group, the stewardship function is one that I'm not sure that the general public is fully aware of how active the Coast Guard is in protecting our oceans, seas, rivers, and lakes. Now, tomorrow, you're going to have about 200, let's call them groupies. If we were all Coast Guard groupies, tomorrow when we go to the Hill, is there a message that you'd like perhaps for us to communicate about how ocean communities like this group assembled can support some of the interests of the Coast Guard?
Well, here's what I would tell you if you were thinking of communicating your message, which is your message, not mine, how to think about some of those things. Because my job is really not to advocate to the Hill. My job is to inform based on my best range of knowledge and experience with respect to what I see. So here's what we're charged with doing. It starts with the ships and the conveyances on the water. The Coast Guard is responsible for making sure that those vessels are constructed in such a way that to the greatest extent possible, they prevent pollution from happening. Pollution from the oils and materials and cargoes that they carry, pollution from the activities of the people on board, whether that's garbage pollution or sewage or all the other things. Think of all the stuff that can come off of a vessel. It's our job to make sure that we do everything possible to design, operate, license the people who operate, create a system that is designed to keep stuff from getting into the water. Now, we know it doesn't always happen. And sometimes you have bad operators, sometimes you have bad construction, sometimes you have failed construction, sometimes systems fail. So what do you do when that happens? Then the next piece of what the Coast Guard is responsible for doing is ensuring that if it does happen, we not only do our best to return the ocean to its condition before it happened, return the waters to its condition through cleanup activities and so forth, response and the like, and requiring the people who operate these things to do the right things in the event of a pollution incident. But the other thing we're required to do is figure out how it happened in the first place, and did something go wrong with the whole system that we designed. So that's the first thing we do with respect to stewardship, is look at this maritime transportation system and the system from the vessel standpoint. Then we look at the stuff that it interfaces with. You know, all those ships and conveyances find their way to some point of land, and then they transfer things to those points of land. So those things they transfer to, we also watch very carefully to the shoreside terminals that receive vessels to make sure that they aren't doing something that could then inject some sort of pollutant back into the water. So that's the practical day-to-day aspect of it. The other piece of stewardship, as I mentioned, is the engagement worldwide with those who actually care about these things, with the various groups. A lot of you in the audience inform us very directly with respect to the concerns that you have with respect to those standards on the vessels, with air emissions and the like. We work very closely with other entities of our federal government as well as other governments around the world to determine what standards should be with respect to pollutants from exhausts and the like. So the stewardship piece is very important to us, and if you think about the Coast Guard as an agency with a very comprehensive set of authorities over the maritime domain for the United States. I mean, from the activities on the domain to the things that go into it to the interactions with other entities around the world. I mean, we really look at everything that happens in the water. And then we also protect, we're charged with protecting the marine resources in the water. So we protect mammals, we set whale exclusionary zones so that the vessels stay away from those areas where we know whales to be migrating. We monitor and enforce operations in the marine sanctuaries. And we do a lot of work around the world to combat illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. And we're looking at, some of the places with the last great biomasses of fish in the world are in the Central Pacific, and they're under attack from all over the world as other areas get fished out. We don't have many resources to do it with, but what I would say is awareness is always important. I said I wanted to put you in the wet world earlier because it's a largely invisible world to people. If you don't go, it looks like an empty world when you're standing on shore, but there's a lot going on out there. And what I would say is the best thing you can do with people who don't understand the oceans is to take them into the ocean. Kind of use Erika's point. Tell them a little story about being in the ocean and talk about what's happening out there. And more importantly, talk about how that directly relates to the health of those of us living on the land, because we depend upon the oceans to sustain our life. And if you look at from the clothes that you wear to the food that you eat to the health of the climate around us.
So, is there any question specifically for Erika, other than can I get a ride with you on your sub? There's one.
Hi, Erika. First, you've done some amazing work. I was wondering, based on last night, we were talking about how we communicate things that we've learned to different groups of people, children. And I was wondering, have you ever considered taking some of your experiences and putting them into books and using that to communicate with kids or adults or young adults? Because you're a very eloquent speaker, so maybe you would be a great writer and a great person to communicate some of these ideas to different people in a unique way.
Thank you. I have not considered necessarily books. I think I enjoy writing a lot, and I keep very extensive pilot logs. My personal pilot logs become the company's pilot logs every time we do these dives. So there is a lot of writing, but I've never really considered including that as part of the education program. More of the direction that I think would be really interesting is to get a great illustrator and have somebody draw these pictures and then write that kind of story about how we use our own sensors in addition to marine technology sensors and compare and contrast the kind of research that we're doing in the ocean. But wanted to thank you. Are you? Is that because you're a writer yourself?
I'm not a writer. I just think that when you were out there, you were really explaining your stories very well, and you could easily match that with an illustrator who does great children's books for young children, and then being able to work up through young adult books and stuff like that, things to get people excited about these issues at a young age. And I think you have a very good voice and experiences that are very unique that would work well to communicate these things.
Well, thank you for the suggestion. I will pursue it.
And thank you for a question that advocates for the print media. So we've got just 20 minutes for a break.